Supervisor. So the focus of tonight's presentation is primarily on the shed and fence regulations that we currently have here in Webster. So I'll just begin with letting everyone know what the current regulations are. Section 225-48 covers utility sheds. So the code states that essentially all utility sheds shall be permitted in a side yard or a rear yard in any residential district no closer to any boundary line than 15 feet. So that's 15 feet off the rear property line and 15 feet off of the side. For fences, it's commensurate with the height of the fence. So 4-foot fences are allowed right on the property line currently. 5-foot tall fences need to be 5 feet from the property line. And the most common fencing style, 6-foot privacy fences, are required to be 10 feet off each property line, both side and rear. So we did a little digging historical background information, utilizing former copies of zoning codes dating back all the way to the late 1930s. So from the research we were able to do, the shed regulation first came into the code around 1938. Actually at that time, there was only a 5-foot setback requirement, and it was later changed to 15 feet sometime in the 1970s. But when initially implemented, the 1940 population, the town of Webster had approximately 5,500 people at the time. What we did was we calculated population density, which is simply taking the number of people and number of residents you have, dividing it by the square mile area of the town. So at that time, there was approximately 164 people per square mile. Moving over in regards to the fence regulations, the first that appeared was in the early 1950s. So the 1950 population of Webster was a little over 7,000 people, still a relatively low population density of about 213 people per square mile. So as I mentioned, that was implemented in the 1950s, and they remain the same as they were back then. So then you take a look at the current, most recent census data from 2020, and the town of Webster's population is roughly 45,327 people. And when you calculate the population density, you can see that it's increased quite a bit since these current regulations were initially implemented. So we're right about 1,350 people per square mile at this point in time. So the next slide is a graphic that illustrates, we wanted to benchmark what other municipalities in Monroe County are doing in regards to fences and sheds. So with the assistance of our building staff, we compiled regulations from all of the towns in Monroe County. And as you can see on the map, Webster is only one of 4 towns that has the setback requirement for a 6-foot privacy fence. All the towns shown in green permit 6-foot privacy fences right up to the lot line. The only towns that don't are indicated in yellow there: Parma, Ogden, Wheatland, and Webster. So the table on the right side just shows you the population, the square miles of each of those towns, and then the relative population density. You can actually take the population of those other 3 towns and add them up all together, and they still do not equal the population level here that we have in Webster currently. The next map shows shed regulations. So like what we did with fences, we compiled all of the town's different setback requirements pertaining to sheds. And this was a little bit varied comparing to fence regulations. But the darkest green color essentially allows a 5-foot setback from either the side or rear property line. The lime greenish colored towns, their setbacks for sheds ranged anywhere between 6 and 10 feet off the property lines. And then the yellow towns had anywhere from 11 feet to 20-foot setback requirements. And again, the other towns in our category are Ogden, Rush, and Mendon, significantly less population density. So what we did was we compiled some historical data, the last 10 years worth of variance applications for both sheds and fences over time. There really isn't a strong pattern to glean off of this. I would have liked to have gone further back, but due to data keeping and the town switching permitting softwares over time, it would have required a really intensive manual effort to go further back prior to 2012. So what we have here is basically showing 10 years worth of data. It seems to ebb and flow. I'm not exactly sure what causes those trends, but just at a glance, some years we have more shed variance applications, and other years we have more fence variance applications. So just a brief recap of the numbers of that 10-year period. So basically from 2012 to 2021, we received a total of 175 applications for variances pertaining to sheds and fences, 104 of them being for sheds, which is on average about 10 cases per year, 71 variance requests for fences, and those are about 7 per year on average, give or take. So out of those 175 applications, approximately 66% of them, or 116 of them, just required attendance by the applicant at one meeting. 29 of those applications required 2 meetings. 7 applications required 3 meetings. There was 1 application that required a total of 4 meetings. There were 2 applications that actually required attendance at 5 meetings. And then 20 of those applications were either denied or withdrawn by the applicant altogether. So here are some unintended consequences of current shed and fence setback regulations. This is a combination of feedback we hear from residents that we deal with at the permit counter, and just some other observations that staff have made. It really limits residents' ability to fully utilize their backyard. 10 feet is a pretty significant strip if you want to enclose your yard. Many families and residents in Webster have young children. They also have dogs, and 4-foot fences generally do not contain dogs or serve to create privacy. If everyone were to erect a fence off, according to the setbacks, you end up with these 20-foot wide, in some cases, unkept alleys between these neighboring fences. Sometimes neither neighbor wants to be bothered with maintaining or mowing the lawn outside of their fence. It actually creates quite a bit of boundary line disputes. So in an instance where you have one neighbor that erects a 6-foot fence 10 feet off the property line, and and chooses not to maintain their lawn outside of that area, most often the neighboring property that looks at that will take it upon themselves to mow it, or they will call the town code enforcement to have the town urge the property owner to mow it. Now, in some cases, in those that actually choose to maintain it themselves, it's created boundary line disputes when people go to sell their property. For those of you that aren't familiar with the term adverse possession, if you are utilizing land and maintaining it after a certain period of time, you actually have legal rights to that piece of property. So another drawback is that for a somewhat common thing that a lot of residents need and want, both sheds and fences, it requires them to go through a pretty robust approval process, often requiring attendance at several meetings before the zoning board. I personally believe it's aesthetically unattractive, but that is my own personal opinion. Some residents, when we articulate what the regulations are at the permit counter, you can just tell their reaction, and they basically indicate that they're not interested in it anymore. But then we find that they go ahead and erect a fence or place a shed anyway. So they're not permitted, obviously. So that leads to enforcement efforts, which are very time-consuming. I think you could drive through just about any neighborhood in the town of Webster and identify many sheds and fences that are clearly not complying with our current regulations. So this next slide provides some photo examples of what I just described. You end up with fences that don't quite meet, with gaps in between them, unkept vegetation, sheds that traditionally are in most places tucked in the corner of a lot are brought much further into the backyard, limiting, again, what people can do in terms of adding decks, patios, swimming pools. I know that when the pandemic started, our building department was flooded with in-ground pool permit requests. I mean, there's pretty much a 2 to 3 year waiting list right now, and a lot of people have decided that, after this pandemic, they, appreciate being outdoors, they appreciate creating spaces on their own property that them and their families can enjoy. So some of the historical justifications for the current shed and fence setbacks, to maintain an open, airy feel for the town. My argument to that would be, Webster has grown quite a bit over the last 60 to 70 years. It is no longer primarily an agricultural town of rolling hills and prairies and farmland. We have a lot of residential development that has occurred over the past few decades. So that would be my response to that. To allow for maintenance of a shed or fence without going on to a neighboring property. The thought with that is with a 4-foot fence, you can reach over and paint the opposite side from your own property, whereas a 6-foot privacy fence may not be, easily accomplished that way. My response to that is a trend that we've been seeing most people going for are these maintenance-free vinyl fences that don't require maintenance. A lot of these fences, you can swap out panels, replace panels from your own side of the property without the need to go onto your neighbor's property. This is another quote that I've heard several times. We don't want Webster to turn into Southern California with everyone walling off their backyards. I think that most people in this room could agree that towns like Perrington, Pittsburgh, Penfield, our closest neighbor to the south, who already have fence regulations that allow fences right up to the property line. I don't believe anyone equates the character of those towns to Southern California. So I think the fear of everyone just running out and installing and fencing their backyards, I don't think that's a valid concern. And another thing that I've often heard is that so that sheds aren't visible from the street. Even sheds that are 15 feet offset can sometimes be visible from the street. I will say that sheds have come a long way. Most of the sheds that we see coming in through the permit office replicate the house. The homeowners are very conscious about it fitting in. They want the same color siding, they want the same style roofing. A lot of them have decorative windows. So they're not your standard metal utility sheds from previous years. They're more aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah, I haven't seen anyone just driving down the street in the village or town slowly just put sheds either, so I don't agree.
So our proposed recommendations and next steps, we would like to continue our analysis of other municipal regulations, draft an actual recommendation based on data and best practices for similarly sized municipalities, and then we would look to have the town board hold a public hearing to get resident feedback on any proposed changes. I would like to clarify, this is primarily dealing with 6-foot fences. We're not suggesting necessarily any changes to 8-foot fences or 10-foot fences. I think when you go higher than 6 feet, having it offset from the property line so that it isn't so imposing on the neighbor is appropriate. But 6-foot privacy fence is the most commonly requested type of fence. It does provide the ability to contain animals and children. And, obviously your neighbor, if they're looking out a 2nd-story window, can look down into your backyard. But when you're, having a barbecue or having a pool party and you're outside, 6 foot does, provide a level of privacy from your neighbors. So, we wouldn't be looking to adjust anything. Fences would still not be permitted in the front setbacks. If there are any existing drainage or sewer easements, we would not permit any fences in those easements without license agreements that we have done in the past. So it's really just trying to reallocate our resources to more impactful things that also need to be addressed, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But it also, I feel, would really improve the customer service experience for our residents. In a lot of these other municipalities, someone can walk into the permit counter, apply for a shuttered fence, and more often than not, they walk out with their permit. With our current situation, as you can see, it sometimes, requires attendance at multiple meetings. And until 6 or 8 months ago, when we switched to the signs, the residents had to mail out to all their neighbors within 100 feet letters to let everyone know what they're doing, and if things get tabled. It's just not an effective use of their energy, in our opinion. And I'll mention, I have with me here tonight our building inspector, Nick Mooney, and our assistant building inspector, Kyle Rader. I also wanted our code enforcement officer to be able to attend tonight, but unfortunately he's off this week. But we are the front lines of town staff that typically deal with the residents at the first point of contact at the permit counter. So I had have our staff here to answer any other questions from their perspective in dealings with residents when these types of issues come up. So there's some other code issues that we would like to start working on as well, which I've listed here. Temporary canopy structures, those carport metal frames with canvas on them. We get a lot of complaints about those. Those can tend to be very unsightly over time. And right now our current code basically says that they can't be used for office or living quarters. It doesn't define where you can place them, how long they can be there, how many you can have. So something like this is a much more problematic thing that we hear complaints from residents on, that we would like to focus our efforts on. Same thing with temporary fences, often used during the winter months to prevent snow drifting. We get a lot of complaints from neighbors when they see an orange temporary fence go up, and our hands are essentially tied because there's nothing in our code that allows us to regulate that in a meaningful way. Telecommunication towers, I believe we had a workshop several months ago on the federal regulations that have recently been adopted and are in major conflict with our local code. Emerging technologies that are either recognized or mentioned. Homesteading is becoming a larger trend. Our code doesn't deal with really raising of animals or chickens, eggs, domesticated things of that nature. Hydroponic farming, a very big gray area in our code that we would like to address. Site plan approval processes, making a distinction between a major and a minor project, and potentially changing how those are reviewed and approved. Defining orders of approval. What order is the most appropriate for a project to go through? Does it start with the planning board or the zoning board? We'd like to strengthen some of the definitions that are left open to interpretation and sometimes used against us. And we'd also like to establish a more robust section that covers different non-conforming uses and structures. So I bring these to your attention because the shed and fence regulations do require a lot of administrative paperwork, a lot of inspections to make sure that people are complying, and I don't necessarily believe that that is the most efficient use of our precious resources. Most local governments are being asked to do more with less, and we just want to make sure that we're focusing our efforts on the most impactful issues that are facing the town. So with that, I will turn it over to the board, and we'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that anyone may have.
Well, I would like to, first off, thank you for bringing this to the board. I've been waiting for this for quite some time. And I did have a question. Are you aware of what the village's setbacks for sheds are?
Yes. The village of Webster has a 8-foot setback for sheds, and they allow fences right up to the property line.
Right. And a resident of the village can walk into the office, fill out a form, and you're good to go. And I think one of the things that you pointed out is of significance is customer service. And you've elaborated on the fact that there's 1, 2, sometimes 3 or 4 different meetings to put up a shed, because people definitely don't want it in the middle of their backyard. And I would most certainly support a public hearing to change these codes for sure. And thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the research that you and your team have done. And I think we hold a public hearing, we'll hear from the public, we'll make a decision, and that's where I come down on the side of this. Thank you once again.
John, what's the height permit for fences in the village? 6 foot?
I'm not sure. I know that the square footage that you're allowed for a shed, because I put one, I think it's either 80 or
What is
100 square
square
feet or
feet?
something.
Yes, 6 foot.
6 foot.
6
So
foot.
anything over 6 foot, you need a variance, but you can put them on the lot line up to 6 feet.
That's my understanding.
Okay. And there's probably how far you can bring it into the front area, I assume.
Correct. And like I mentioned, we wouldn't be proposing any changes to that portion of the regulation, because we certainly don't want, 6 foot fences in the front yard.
Right.
We're primarily talking about the rear yards.
Right. Okay.
What is the current regulation for how far you can bring a 6 or 4 foot fence from the back down the side yard? How far?
Anything in the front yard has to be 4 foot or less, and it has to be decorative. It cannot be solid, can't be chain link.
Okay.
It's to the front of the house. It has to be even with the front of the house facing the road, correct?
No, if it's less than 4 feet decorative, it can go up the property line,
If it's 4 feet.
yes.
Or less.
And just to add, Penfield, I just double checked their website before we came down here. For a 6 foot fence on the line, you don't even need a permit.
Jenny, do you have any questions or?
So people who ever had it before, they can grandfather in, right? There's no issue with that, or do they have to, take the fence down if they're shut down because of the new enforcement?
No, Charlie, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that by changing the setbacks, we would actually be bringing a lot of the sheds and fences that aren't currently in compliance into compliance. And then anyone that had received the variance in the past, they received permission to go closer, and I don't believe there'd be any negative implications on that.
You're not both on.
I was gonna say, I love it. I love it, but this is the anti-grandfathering thing. What, there'd be no reason.
Well, you're not grandfathering. This is
No, we
making it
be loosening the code up.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so,
So how does Penfield know that the fence is not being installed in one of their easements?
Well, they do have a notation on there that special permission is required if you are proposing to put a fence.
You have to go through, if there is an easement and you're proposing to put a fence in an easement, you have to go to a town board meeting and sign a hold harmless agreement.
But they have to find the fence in the easement
Yes.
before that occurs. Thank you.
well, I don't think
Majority of
you
the multiple meetings for the same applicant, my observation has been, correct me if I'm wrong, is the applicants 90% of the times, they're not prepared.
Well, hang on 1 second, because I'm just thinking where the cameras are and whatever. 2 things. One, Don, I don't think anybody but in the room can hear you, so you're not on the tape right now.
That's good.
Well, I mean, if you want to go to the podium, but the funny thing is that you gotta love Mr. Housen. I said, I'd love you guys here for being the panel to answer questions. I should have known. Don's gonna ask questions. Sorry. No, I love it. It's good.
The other thing I would suggest in Penfield, and what we see many times, is new homeowners come to us. All of a sudden, it came about because we said something, that there was an easement. They don't even know there's an easement.
That's right.
So if they're not going to town hall in Penfield,
But the
just
permit's
putting
not
a fence
required.
up, they don't even know the easement's
Well,
there.
and that's why we're not proposing to not have a permit
Thank you.
required.
I didn't hear that
Stating
right in
that
the proposal.
Penfield, that's their, I would never propose that, because then we have no idea if a fence is going up, where it's going up, if it's 3 feet on the neighbor's property.
And I hope my friend Vicente doesn't take this out of context, but what you're talking about is tantamount to, well, Jimmy jumped off the bridge, why can't I jump off the bridge?
And,
We're not looking to jump up.
and on the other hand, is if they're getting bad information or information that they don't like what they're hearing across the counter, and they install it anyhow, it's easier to build it now and ask for forgiveness later. Then it puts us in a bad spot, us being the town. Well, shame on you. My opinion. Thank you.
Well, I heard it, I don't know if we go back to the tape that anybody's gonna hear it then. I still think you should take the podium, you got nice color, you must have been down south. All right? You should.
I blood pressure.
You've been talking to my doctor, just had a physical with us.
I don't know how to follow that up. Bill. That was great, Bill. Bill, you have any questions on this?
No, I think there's a need for change in regulations, especially for the areas that are your 281s, the cluster development. They're killers.
And it,
They're absolute killers of the code. They're just easy solution is, okay, that lot is maybe 50% of a normal lot for that original district.
And
Don, I love you, but I can't hear you.
I love you too, honey.
come on, Dan, get up at that podium. Green, you should follow him.
all right, we'll go together.
All right, for everybody watching at home on tape, you're looking at two of the esteemed members of our zoning board of appeals, Corinne Volo and Don House.
I'm done, that's for sure.
I wanted to be done today.
Okay, go ahead now.
The cluster subdivisions are one of the issues that we tend to have. I'm assuming that they did not exist when the codes and the setbacks were established. And you have a house that can be 5 feet from a lot line, and yet the shed still has to be 15 feet. Whether we change the setbacks in their entirety for the additional structures, or if you make these structures match the setback of the house, it's just, the town has evolved where the setbacks is a carte blanche, everything thou shalt be at 10 or 15 or 20 feet. Just, it's no longer logical with the development that is now happening in Webster.
Corinne, can I, before, in the second to last or whatever slide, Josh did a proposal, and I always say, he took a white piece of paper and had it drafted. So he gave the idea of 7.5 shed and whatever, and 6-foot fences on the line. Now that's why we'll have public hearings and talk about this. We're not making any decisions tonight. I've said, I think you and I are saying the same thing, Corinne, is that there might be something specific to zoning, because the smaller the lot, when you get into those cluster lots, some of those lots are 10,000 square feet. There's just nothing there. So do you, where an R2 and R3 is 22,000, 28,000, so is that what you mean by a la carte? Like we almost have to?
Not necessarily making them bigger for bigger lots, but when you have a, when I've got, and I'll use the cluster subdivision as the example, when you have that, and the houses can be typically either 5 feet from the lot line and 15 feet between dwellings, it makes no sense that the bulk structure can be 5 feet and yet the shed still has to be another 10 feet in. It's just, it's not in
One of his
my
slides
engineering
showed
brain
that,
logic.
actually, right there.
Yeah.
It showed a 10,000 cluster.
Yeah, but I mean, the
layout.
clusters over off of Phillips, they're very skinny lots and they're short, so. And maybe that's part of the subdivision approval process.
Well, those were supposed to be patio homes initially.
And now they all have pools and fences and sheds.
Yeah. People wanted the, smaller lot, the large house, which was supposed to be a patio home and evolved to, normal size homes for that era. And people want to have whatever they could have on a normal size lot.
Don't you call that, Shirley, the 10-pound, whatever?
Yes.
Well, if I'm paying taxes on it, I ought to be able to use all of it, I think is the
Yes.
mentality that we get. And
People don't
we've not,
understand what they're purchasing. in relationship to what the regulations are, and it's really not their priority at the time of purchase, until they, becomes a priority to install a fence or a shed, and then becomes an issue.
You know what's funny about that, and I don't want us to go too deep in the weeds on this tonight. And Josh knows we've talked, Josh, obviously Josh has been here 2 years, a little over 2 years, married and whatever. One of the things we have talked about doing is once a property changes type, whether you're buying a new property, whether you're buying an existing house and not having more, is like a month after they move in, a welcome pack to the town of Webster that somewhat does in a very succinct way, colorful, not a war and peace, just this is what you got. So, because how many people walk in here, I didn't know. And you can sit there and say, and this is a guy coming from the mortgage industry, Charlie, you've been in real estate closings. Well, your attorney, didn't they explain that at the closing? You're going through 500 documents in the closing. You're desensitized.
Well, and in most real estate contracts, there's just a blanket clause that says it conforms to the zoning, and if any permits are needed or required, they're given. So that sort of, nobody really looks too closely at that at the time. They don't understand what that is. They're just concerned about the house, getting the money for the house, which is, like you say, most of the paperwork is involved in the loan.
And it's funny, because, and I'm glad that Don and Karina are here today, because I can't stress this enough. We're not trying to make the zoning board of appeals not, obsolete. And that, by no means, because you will still have a lot of things coming across your desk. And that's why when you said your proposal doesn't get into the 8-foot fences and whatever, because they'll be heard by the zoning board of appeals if they want to be, closer or not as far off the line. But it just seems as though from this data, 10 years of data, you have 24 meetings a year, maybe not even, because some of these zoning board of appeals meetings are canceled for whatever reasons. And to think that you have about 18 of these a year between shed and fence over the last 10 years, you're talking almost one a meeting. And I know that, I've watched some of your meetings and this and that, those meetings go sometimes till 9:30. Once again, the inefficient use.
It's not like the 3 o'clockers years ago, right?
They're
Well, I mean,
4:30 in the morning.
Well, being nice.
But I just want to say what Josh said about, resources, and we're trying to do more with less and trying to be efficient from the 3 gentlemen at that panel. That's also, we're trying to be more efficient for the 5 people that are on the zoning board of appeals.
Well, and I think you have less people, now no one does this really, just putting it up anyway, and if I get caught, I get caught. And then I'll come to the zoning board and I'll get a variance because I put it where I wanted it. If the setbacks are more reasonable, based on the evolution of the town, I'd like to believe we would get less
I see.
ignoring of what you're supposed to apply for.
No.
Maybe not, I don't know.
No, if they want to ignore it, they're going to ignore it.
No, you're absolutely.
But looking at some of these suggestions, 7.5 feet, other than the fence being permitted on the property line of having a height of 6 feet, majority of the requests have been 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet.
Right, we've had a couple that have wanted them on the lot line. Very rarely do we allow it. I love E-code, because I'm retired and I had nothing else to do today, it was cold out. I went through the different municipalities and what they do for fences, and they're much broader in what's allowed and what's not allowed than I would have expected. But a majority of the towns do allow 6 feet on the property line. My only concern as the zoning board person who gets the irate neighbor when you go look at the property is the maintenance on the backside of a 6-foot fence. And maybe we don't care. It doesn't seem to be a problem in Penfield. They're on the lot line in Pittsford, and I don't see a bunch of people in up in arms. Menton allows it on the lot line. So maybe, and maybe you get along with your neighbor and he allows you to go paint the fence every couple of years if you need to.
Well, as Josh said, the fence is now with panels,
And yeah, for the
Yeah,
most
Well, you can just put
part,
that, you can just
I
put
would
that
say
in the permit.
95% of the
It's
physical
required.
privacy fences are
Charlie.
maintenance.
Charlie.
Yeah.
it's,
I mean, I had.
It's like, yeah, parking back there.
I'm coming from my fence, which is on the lot line, that's the old picket thing, you know, I got from Chase Pickett, I think, put it up myself, but the fact is that you required, the zoning board, which I was sitting on at the time, they required that the more decorative side faced the
Right.
neighbor.
Right.
Now,
Which is where
it's
all of my
never been
fiestas
painted.
are.
It's been there for 32 years or 33 years, it's never been painted. But
and
it
your
doesn't
neighbor
have
has
to
a
be.
complaint?
But I think just put it in now just put it in the permit process, that, yeah, we'll give you a permit, but the fence has to be.
And 99% of the
Yeah,
vinyl
plastic
fences,
or
they're
whatever.
the same on both
Right,
sides.
right.
And Charlie, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of what we've been talking about the last few minutes is almost like, take Josh's end of his presentation. Here's what he's suggesting, we do this, go to a public hearing, get, people's thoughts.
Yeah.
We propose something, but that's not the final rule, because we'll hear what people have to say.
But you're not talking about a formal public hearing, you're talking about like an informational meeting just to get it in.
Well, or do you
I
rewrite
Oh,
it?
public hearing is,
I
it's a
think-
legal term.
I'm talking about the legal, isn't that what you were talking about, Josh, in your presentation?
I see what the point you're making, Charlie, is what are we, the public hearing?
Well, public hearing is where you have a local law proposed and you come in and you hear on this specific law, and you just want to get people's input.
So I'm gonna go back to this slide, it
It's up
says,
to you.
draft revised regulations based on data and best practices, and then hold public hearing.
Oh, okay, so you do want to have a law.
Now, we just did this last year with the sign versus the 300 feet away letters. And we posed the drafted change. We held the public hearing. If you remember, there were 4 of them because that touched 4 different codes. And then we adopted it. I kind of saw this would be the same thing.
Oh, that's
The
fine.
interesting thing being, just if the draft says what Josh has there, 7.5 feet on the setback and 6 feet on the property line, the public hearing, based on the citizens coming in and hopefully things that you're saying there, maybe that public hearing says we tweak off of that draft based on what we heard. Can it?
Yeah, well, sure,
That's
of
the-
course.
That's the purpose of a public hearing. Remember, that comes in and says, this is great. So,
What's your water doing, Bill?
It's gone.
it is
What's gone?
7:01, and that's basically what I was saying is that I think we're past the Q&A portion, and I was saying the last couple minutes, almost getting into like public hearing type of discussion. Why don't we save that for a moment?
But I just want to, you're not married to these numbers at this point, because you said you want to do some more benchmarking, so it may not be exactly what you outlined here for a public hearing.
Right. Exactly.
So just wanted to
Good work,
clarify that.
Team, thank you.
Yeah. and
So you,
Don and Corinne, thanks for being here.
and Corinne and Don and other people are doing sort of a mini advisory panel on what should be
Yes,
done.
yeah.
I guess I just
Well, and I mean, I'll
hired
help do whatever legwork you need.
volunteered you, I should say.
I think you did.
Okay.